My name is Nora, and I'm 26 years old. For as long as I can remember, my parents warned me about the woman who lived next door. She is dangerous, they said, not with drama or explanation, just cold certainty, the way you'd warn a child about a hot stove. I never questioned it. I never spoke to her. I never even learned her name. But when she died and left me everything in her will, I discovered that the most dangerous thing about her wasn't what my parents claimed. It was what she knew. And what she knew was about to shatter everything I believed about the people who raised me. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories. I was 6 years old the first time I heard my mother say it. We were in the backyard, and I'd wandered too close to the fence separating our property from the house next door. I wasn't doing anything wrong, just picking dandelions, the way kids do when they don't know any better. But my mother's voice cut through the afternoon air like a warning siren.
Nora.
Come here.
Now.
I dropped the flowers and ran back to her. She crouched down, gripping my shoulders with both hands, her face serious in a way that made my stomach twist. Listen to me carefully, she said. The woman who lives in that house? You don't talk to her. You don't go near her. You don't wave. You don't smile. Do you understand? I nodded, confused. Why? I asked. My mother's jaw tightened. Because she's dangerous. That was it.
No explanation.
No details. Just a fact, delivered with the same finality she used when she told me not to touch the stove or run into the street. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply true, in the way adults present truths to children, absolute and unchallengeable. I accepted it the way I accepted everything else back then. Dangerous meant bad. Dangerous meant stay away. And I did. But the woman next door became a presence in my life anyway, not through interaction, but through absence. I learned her rhythms without ever speaking to her. Her curtains were always drawn, thick and heavy, blocking any glimpse inside. Her small front garden was kept obsessively neat, every edge trimmed, every weed removed, though I never saw her working on it. The lights in her house stayed on late into the night, casting faint glows through the fabric barriers she'd erected between herself and the world. I never heard her voice. I never learned her name. She was just the woman next door, and that was all I was allowed to know. My parents didn't just warn me once and move on. They enforced the rule constantly, with a vigilance that felt excessive even to my child's mind. If I lingered too long near the property line, my father would appear and pull me back by the arm. If I accidentally glanced in her direction while playing outside, my mother would snap my name like I'd done something unforgivable. Once, when I was 8, I absent-mindedly waved in the general direction of her yard while saying goodbye to a friend. My father grabbed me by the wrist and dragged me inside so fast I stumbled over my own feet. "What did we tell you?" he hissed, his face red. I wasn't waving at her. I protested. I was just, "It doesn't matter. You don't do anything that could be misinterpreted. Do you understand me?" I nodded, tears burning in my eyes. I didn't understand, but I was too afraid to ask. As I grew older, the language around her changed. The word dangerous evolved into something more specific, more damning. My mother started calling her unstable. My father referred to her as a liar. At dinner parties, when neighbors came over, I'd hear whispered conversations in the kitchen, adults using words like complaint and court and restraining order, though they'd stop talking the moment they noticed me nearby. The fragments I caught never formed a complete picture. I heard my mother say, "She lies about everything," and my father mutter, "She's tried to ruin families before." But no one ever explained what she'd done, who she'd hurt, or why we were the specific targets of her supposed malice. When I was 14, my parents installed a tall wooden fence along the entire property line. They said it was for privacy, but I knew better. The timing was too obvious. The fence went up in late spring, and I'd overheard my father on the phone a week earlier, his voice tight with frustration, saying something about blocking her view and establishing boundaries. The fence was over 6 feet tall, solid planks with no gaps. It cast a shadow over our backyard and made the space feel smaller, enclosed. But my parents seemed relieved. My mother smiled more. My father stopped glancing toward the neighbor's house every time we went outside. The fence became a physical manifestation of the separation they'd spent years drilling into me. But it also became something else, a symbol of how much effort they were willing to expend to keep me away from her. And that made me wonder, if she was really so dangerous, why do we have to work so hard to avoid her? Dangerous people don't require fences. Dangerous people make themselves known. But this woman never did. She never yelled. She never approached. She never retaliated. For someone supposedly unstable and malicious, she was remarkably quiet. I started noticing the contradictions. I started feeling uneasy. One afternoon when I was 16, I was sitting on the back porch reading when I heard a sound from the other side of the fence. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. I froze. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard a soft sigh, barely audible, like someone standing just on the other side of the wood. My heart pounded. I told myself to go inside, to follow the rule, but instead, I stood up and walked to the fence. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or guilt, or the uncomfortable realization that I'd spent my entire life being afraid of someone I'd never even seen up close. There was a small gap where two planks didn't quite meet. I leaned closer, and through the narrow opening, I saw her. She was standing just a few feet away, staring at the fence. At me, though she couldn't have known I was there. She looked older than I'd imagined, with gray hair pulled into a low ponytail and deep lines around her eyes. She wasn't scary. She wasn't imposing. She just looked tired and sad. Then our eyes met through the gap. She startled, her hand flying to her chest. But then something shifted in her expression. Surprise melted into something that looked almost like relief. She raised her hand slightly, as if to speak or wave, her lips parting. I panicked. I stepped back, turned, and walked quickly into the house, my pulse racing. That night, my parents knew.
I don't know how.
Maybe they'd been watching from the window. Maybe they saw the way I came inside too fast, too flustered. But at dinner, my mother set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between anger and fear. "Did you go near the fence today?" she asked. My throat tightened. "I was just reading on the porch." "Did you look at her?" I hesitated. That hesitation was enough. My father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "Nora, answer the question." "I didn't talk to her," I said quickly. "I didn't do anything. You just what?" my mother snapped. "You just gave her an opening? You just let her think she could manipulate you." "I didn't do anything," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I don't even know what she's supposed to have done. You've never told me." The silence that followed was suffocating. My parents exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations adults have when they're deciding how much truth a child can handle. "You don't need to know," my mother said finally, her voice cold. "You just need to trust us." But I didn't. Not anymore. That night, lying in bed, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. This wasn't about keeping me safe. This was about keeping me ignorant. Whatever the truth was, my parents were terrified of me learning it. And the woman next door, the one they'd spent my entire life calling dangerous, had looked at me through that fence gap with something that wasn't malice. It was hope. As I got older, I started paying attention to how other people treated her. And what I noticed unsettled me. It wasn't just my parents. The whole neighborhood avoided her. But it wasn't the kind of avoidance you'd expect if someone were genuinely dangerous. No one seemed afraid of her. They just acted like she didn't exist. When she walked to her mailbox, neighbors would suddenly find urgent reasons to go back inside. If she was in her front yard, people crossed the street rather than walk past her house. At neighborhood gatherings, the annual 4th of July barbecue, the holiday potluck, her house was the only one that never got an invitation slipped under the door. I asked my friend Melissa about it once. We were 15, sitting on her porch across the street. "Why doesn't anyone talk to the woman in the gray house?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Melissa shrugged. "I don't know. My mom says she's weird." "Weird how?" I don't know.
She sued someone or something.
My mom doesn't really talk about it. I pressed. Sued them for what? I don't know, Nora. Why do you care? I didn't have an answer for that. So, I dropped it. But I kept listening. And the more I heard, the less sense it made. Every version of the story was different. Mrs. Chun from 3 houses down said the woman had made false accusations about someone years ago. Mr. Patel, who lived on the corner, mentioned something about a custody battle. The Johnsons claimed she'd gotten someone fired from their job with lies. None of the stories aligned. None of them had specifics. They were all vague, secondhand, the kind of rumors that get repeated until they harden into fact without anyone remembering where they started. What bothered me most was how the rumors contradicted what I could see with my own eyes. This supposedly dangerous, unstable, malicious woman lived the quietest life imaginable. She went to work early in the morning. I'd see her car pull out of the driveway before 7. She came home in the evening and disappeared inside. She shopped at odd hours, always alone, always efficient. She never had visitors. She never hosted parties. She never caused scenes. If anything, she seemed like she was trying to disappear. One winter, we got hit with a massive snowstorm. 2 feet of snow fell overnight, and the whole neighborhood spent the next morning digging out driveways and clearing sidewalks. I was inside drinking hot chocolate when my mother called me to the window. "Look at that," she said, her voice tight. I looked. The woman next door had cleared not only her own driveway but half of ours as well. The snow was neatly piled to the side, the path from our driveway to the sidewalk perfectly shoveled. She was nowhere in sight. She'd done it early, before we woke up, and left without a word. "She's trying to manipulate us," my mother said. "By shoveling snow?" I asked. "By making us feel like we owe her something. By making herself look generous. It's a tactic, Nora. Don't fall for it." I stared at the cleared path and said nothing. But inside, I was screaming. How could an act of kindness, silent, anonymous, requiring nothing in return, be manipulative? How could helping people who hated you be a tactic? It didn't make sense. And my parents' refusal to even acknowledge the possibility of goodness in her felt more and more like willful blindness. When I left for college, something shifted. My parents relaxed. Not about her, they still talked about her with the same disdain, but about controlling what I knew. Distance gave them a false sense of security. They thought I'd forget. They thought I'd move on. But I didn't. During winter break of my sophomore year, I came home for the holidays. I was rummaging through the kitchen drawer looking for batteries when I found them. 3 sealed envelopes, all addressed in the same slanted handwriting. The return address was the house next door. The envelopes were dated over the past 2 years, one from each birthday I'd had since turning 18. I held them up when my mother walked into the kitchen. "What are these?" I asked. Her face went white, then red. Then she snatched them out of my hand. "Those are none of your business." "They have my birthday dates on them," I said. "They're addressed to this house. How are they not my business?" "We don't engage with her," my mother said, her voice shaking. "We don't read her letters. We don't respond. We don't give her an opening." "An opening for what?" She didn't answer. She just shoved the envelopes back into the drawer and slammed it shut. That night, I waited until my parents were asleep. I crept downstairs and opened the drawer as quietly as I could. The envelopes were gone. My mother had hidden them somewhere I'd never find them. But I'd seen the dates. I'd seen the handwriting. And I knew that for 2 years, this woman had been trying to reach me, and my parents had intercepted every attempt. A week later, my father almost told me the truth. It was late, after a family dinner that had devolved into tense silence. My mother had gone to bed early with a headache, and my father and I were cleaning up the kitchen. He'd had a few glasses of wine, more than usual, and his movements were slow, deliberate. "She wasn't always like this," he said suddenly. I froze, a plate in my hand. "Who?" He didn't answer right away. He stared out the window toward the fence, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. "Dad." I pressed. He shook his head, set down the dish towel, and walked out of the room. I stood there alone, my heart pounding. She wasn't always like this. Like what? Dangerous? A liar? Or something else entirely, something he couldn't bring himself to admit? I left for school the next day feeling heavier than I'd arrived. I'd come home looking for comfort, for familiarity, for the easy warmth of childhood memories. Instead, I'd found envelopes hidden in drawers and half-confessions swallowed back down. I'd found proof that my parents were hiding something, and that the woman next door had been trying, quietly and persistently, to tell me what it was. I felt complicit. I'd spent years benefiting from silence, living in a house built on secrets I didn't question because it was easier not to. I'd let my parents curate my reality, and I'd never pushed back hard enough to break through. But now I knew. I knew there were letters I'd never read. I knew there were truths I'd never been told. I knew my parents weren't protecting me from danger. They were protecting themselves from exposure. I found out she was dead by accident. I was scrolling through my phone during a slow afternoon at work when I saw a link to the local obituary page. I don't know why I clicked it. Boredom, maybe, or the morbid curiosity that sometimes strikes when you're procrastinating. I scanned the names without really reading them. Then I stopped. There was no photo. The entry was bare bones, just a name, a date of birth, a date of death, and the name of a funeral home. No surviving family members listed.
No heartfelt tribute.
No celebration of life details. Just passed away peacefully on March 14th, services to be held at Riverside Memorial Chapel. The date of death was 2 weeks earlier. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Then I called my mother. Did you know? I asked as soon as she picked up. Know what? That she died. The woman next door. 2 weeks ago. There was a pause. Not the pause of someone processing shocking news. The pause of someone deciding how to respond to news they already had. Yes, my mother said finally. We knew. My hand tightened around the phone. And you didn't think to tell me? Why would we? She said, her tone maddeningly calm. It doesn't concern you, Nora. It's over now. Over. Like it was a problem that had been solved. Like a person's death was a relief instead of a tragedy. She lived next door to us my entire life. I said, my voice shaking. And you didn't think I deserved to know she died? We didn't see the point in bringing it up. You've moved on. You have your own life. There was no reason to drag you back into that. Into what? I wanted to scream. Into the truth? Into the reality you've spent decades hiding from me? But I didn't. I just said, I'm going to the funeral. Nora. I hung up. I don't know what I expected to find at the funeral. Answers, maybe. Or closure. Or just the chance to see, one final time, the woman my parents had spent my entire childhood teaching me to fear. The service was held on a gray Saturday morning at a small chapel on the edge of town. I arrived early, parked in the nearly empty lot, and sat in my car for 10 minutes, trying to steady my breathing. When I finally walked inside, I realized just how alone she'd been. The chapel was small, with rows of folding chairs set up in front of a simple casket. There were no flowers except for one generic arrangement from the funeral home. White lilies and greenery, the kind they probably use for every service when no one orders anything personal. No photos. No memory boards. No gathering of loved ones whispering stories about the deceased. Just me. I sat in the front row, because there was no reason not to. The officiant, a man in his 50s with a kind but tired face, looked surprised to see me. He approached and asked quietly if I was family. No, I said. Just a neighbor. He nodded and didn't press. A few minutes later, the service began. It was brief. The officiant read from a standard script, the kind of generalized tribute that could apply to anyone. He mentioned her name, Evelyn Marsh, and I realized with a jolt that I was hearing it for the first time. My parents had never used it. To them, she'd only ever been that woman or the neighbor or her. But she had a name. Evelyn. Near the end of the service, the officiant paused and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Ms. Marsh left a note, he said. She asked that it be read aloud at her service. It's brief. He unfolded the paper and read, To whoever is here, thank you for remembering me. I spent a long time being forgotten. Your presence means more than you know. My throat tightened. I was the only person there, which meant she'd written that note knowing there might not be anyone to hear it. Or worse, hoping that just one person might show up. And somehow, impossibly, I had. After the burial, I stood by the grave for a long time, staring at the plain headstone they'd placed temporarily until a permanent one could be made. The ground was still raw, freshly turned, and the air smelled like rain. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw a man in a dark suit approaching. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes. He carried a leather briefcase. "Nora Whitlock?" he asked. I blinked.
Yes.
"How do you?" "I'm David Brennan," he said, extending a hand. I was Ms. Marsh's attorney. I shook his hand, confused. "I don't understand. Why are you?" "I've been looking for you," he said. "Ms. Marsh left specific instructions regarding you in her will." My stomach dropped. I barely knew her. I never even spoke to her. "I know," he said. His expression was unreadable. "But she knew you. And she left you something." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card, handing it to me. "Did your parents finally tell you?" he asked. "Tell me what?" He studied my face for a moment, and something sad flickered in his eyes. "Then we need to talk. Privately." I met David Brennan at his office 3 days later. It was a small, unassuming building on a quiet street downtown, the kind of place that looked like it had been there for decades. The waiting room smelled like old paper and coffee. He led me into a cramped office lined with filing cabinets and boxes stacked along the walls. Each box was labeled with dates, some going back 30 years or more. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk.
I sat.
My hands were shaking, so I clasped them in my lap. David settled into his chair and pulled out a thick folder. He opened it carefully, like it contained something fragile. "Ms. Marsh named you as a primary beneficiary in her will," he said without preamble. I stared at him. "That doesn't make sense. I never even met her." "Legally, you did," he said. "You lived next door to her for 18 years. That constitutes knowledge of her existence, even if your parents forbade interaction." "But why me? I'm nobody to her." David's expression softened. "You're not nobody, Nora. You're the one person she trusted to do what she couldn't. Which is, hold the truth." He slid the folder across the desk toward me. I opened it slowly. Inside were legal documents, pages and pages of filings, complaints, court orders, and correspondence. My parents' names appeared over and over. "Your parents aren't beneficiaries," David said. "In fact, they're explicitly excluded. Ms. Marsh made that very clear." I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding. Why? Because they're the reason she spent the last 35 years of her life in legal limbo. I looked up sharply. "What are you talking about?" David leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Evelyn Marsh worked with your mother in the early 90s. They were colleagues, social workers specifically. They handled cases involving vulnerable individuals, mostly children and elderly people in state care." I felt cold. "Okay. There was an incident," David continued. "A case where funds meant for a client were misappropriated. Your mother and father were involved. Evelyn witnessed it. She reported it. And your parents preempted her. They filed a complaint against Evelyn first, claiming she was unstable, that she was fabricating accusations, that she had a history of dishonesty. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. Once the accusation was made, Evelyn's credibility was destroyed. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. So, everything they said about her was a lie," David finished. "Or more accurately, a preemptive strike. They labeled her dangerous before she could expose them. And it worked." He pulled out another document, a timeline. "Over the next 3 decades, your parents filed multiple complaints and lawsuits against Evelyn. None of them were successful. Most were dismissed. But that wasn't the point. The point was to drain her financially and emotionally, to isolate her, to make sure no one would believe her if she ever tried to speak out." "But why did she stay?" I asked, my voice breaking. Why didn't she just leave? Go somewhere else. Because leaving would have destroyed her case, David said. The original incident involved proximity. Living near your parents gave her legal standing as a witness. If she'd left, she would have lost that. So she stayed. For 35 years. Waiting. For what? For you to grow up. I stared at him, my mind reeling. David opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed box. It was small, wooden, with a brass latch. He set it on the desk between us. This is what she left you, he said. Documents. Recordings. Evidence. And a letter. She wrote it years ago, waiting for the day you'd be old enough and independent enough to read it. I reached out and touched the box, my fingers trembling. There's a condition, David said. You have to read the letter first. Alone. Those were her explicit instructions. After that, you can decide what to do with the rest. I nodded, unable to speak. David stood and handed me the box. It was heavier than I expected. I'll give you privacy, he said. Take your time. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the box. Then, with shaking hands, I opened the latch. Inside was a stack of documents, a small recorder, and a handwritten letter on top. The envelope had my full name written on it in careful, slanted handwriting. Nora Elizabeth Whitlock. I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. The first line made my breath catch. They told you I was dangerous because the truth would have destroyed them. I kept reading. Evelyn's handwriting was neat, precise, the kind that came from years of careful documentation. She addressed me by name, my full name, correctly, something I realized she'd never had the chance to learn from me directly. She must have seen it on mail, or heard my parents say it, or pieced it together over years of watching from a distance. She explained who she was. Not a stranger. Not an enemy. A witness. She described the incident that started everything, a case involving an elderly client whose care funds had been redirected. My mother had been the case manager. My father had handled the financial side. Evelyn had been the one who noticed the discrepancies and reported them internally. The complaint should have led to an investigation. Instead, it led to her professional destruction. She explained why she stayed. Not out of obsession or revenge, but because leaving would have invalidated her credibility. The law required proximity for her testimony to hold weight. So she bought the house next door, knowing it would make her look unstable, knowing it would fuel my parents' narrative. She stayed because she believed, somehow, that the truth would matter eventually. She stayed because of me. I watched you grow up, she wrote. I know that sounds invasive, but I need you to understand. I wasn't watching you out of malice. I was watching to make sure you were okay. You were the only innocent person in this situation. And I refused to let your childhood be destroyed by forcing the truth too early. She listed every attempt she'd made to contact me once I turned 18. Letters sent and intercepted. Phone calls blocked. Legal attempts to reach me shut down by my parents' lawyers. She'd tried. Over and over. And every time my parents had stopped her. I'm writing this knowing I may not live to see you read it, she continued. But I need you to know, I never hated you. I never blamed you. You were a child. You deserved better than to be raised in a house built on lies. The letter ended with a single line that broke me. You are the only person I trust to carry this forward. Not for revenge, just for truth. I sat there in that quiet office, tears streaming down my face, holding a letter from a woman I'd been taught to fear my entire life. A woman who had protected me, even when I didn't know I needed protecting. A woman who had carried the weight of the truth alone for 35 years, waiting for the day she could finally hand it to someone who might actually listen. The door opened softly. David stepped back inside and saw my face. Now you understand, he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the desk. The documents in that box are enough to reopen investigations, he said. Enough to expose what your parents did. But that's not a decision I can make for you. Evelyn left it in your hands. I looked down at the box, at the letter still clutched in my fingers. What happens if I do nothing? I asked. Then the truth dies with you. David said simply. And your parents win. I closed my eyes. For 35 years, Evelyn Marsh had waited. She'd endured isolation, legal harassment, and a lifetime of being called a liar. She'd sacrificed everything, her career, her reputation, her peace, to preserve the truth. And now it was mine, not as a burden, as a choice. I opened my eyes and met David's gaze. Tell me everything, I said. I took the box home with me that night. David had offered to let me review everything in his office, but I needed to be alone for this. I needed space to process what I was about to learn without anyone watching my reaction. My apartment felt too quiet as I set the box on my kitchen table. I made tea I didn't drink and paced the small living room 3 times before finally sitting down and opening it again. Evelyn's letter was still on top. I'd already read it once, but I read it again, slower this time, absorbing every word. She'd addressed me by my full name, Nora Elizabeth Whitlock, and somehow that detail hit me harder the second time. She knew my middle name. She'd paid attention to details about me that my own parents had tried to erase from her awareness. The letter began with immediate clarification, as if she'd anticipated my first question. I am not your relative. I am not your enemy. I am the witness your parents tried to erase. She didn't waste words. Every sentence was deliberate, carefully chosen to convey maximum truth in minimum space. It read like someone who'd spent decades writing reports, documenting facts, building cases that required precision. I worked with your mother in the early 1990s, she wrote. We were both employed by the county's Department of Social Services. Your mother was a case manager. I was a casework supervisor. We weren't friends, but we were colleagues tied to the same vulnerable populations, children in foster care, elderly individuals in state guardianship, disabled adults requiring protective services. I tried to picture my mother in that role. I'd known she'd worked in social services before I was born, but she'd never talked about it in detail. She'd always framed it as stressful work she was glad to leave behind when she had me. Now I understood why she never wanted to talk about it. In August of 1993, I noticed discrepancies in the financial records for one of our elderly clients, a woman named Dorothy Brennan, who had no living family and was under state guardianship. Funds allocated for her care were being redirected. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate detection but significant enough to matter to someone living on a fixed income. Dorothy Brennan. I thought of David, Evelyn's attorney, and wondered if there was a connection. The last name couldn't be a coincidence. I traced the discrepancies back to your mother's caseload. Your father, who worked in the county finance office, had processed the transfers. I reported my findings to our supervisor, following protocol exactly as I'd been trained. That should have been the end of it. An internal investigation, corrective action, maybe a quiet resignation. Instead, it became the beginning of Evelyn's destruction. Your parents filed a formal complaint against me 3 days before the scheduled review meeting. They claimed I had a history of erratic behavior, that I'd made false accusations against colleagues before, that I was fabricating evidence due to a personal vendetta. None of it was true, but by filing first, they controlled the narrative. I felt sick. This wasn't just lying. This was strategic, premeditated character assassination. The investigation shifted focus from the financial discrepancies to my mental stability. Your mother provided evidence. Emails I'd supposedly sent that I never wrote, complaints from colleagues I'd never worked with, documentation of incidents that never happened. Your father's position in the finance office gave him access to alter records. By the time I tried to defend myself, I'd already been labeled unreliable. The letter explained what happened next. Evelyn was placed on administrative leave pending a psychiatric evaluation, standard procedure when someone's stability was questioned. The evaluation cleared her, but the damage was done. Colleagues avoided her. Her supervisor reassigned her cases. Within 6 months, she was pressured to resign. I could have walked away, Evelyn wrote. I could have moved to another city, started over, let it go. But Dorothy Brennan was still being robbed, and no one else was going to help her. So Evelyn stayed. She filed a civil complaint. She hired an attorney, a young lawyer named David Brennan, Dorothy's nephew, who just learned his aunt was being exploited by the very people meant to protect her. David and I built a case. We had financial records, correspondence, documentation of the transfers. We had witnesses willing to testify about your parents' sudden lifestyle improvements, a new car, a down payment on a house, vacation expenses that didn't match their reported income. But before they could file, my parents struck again. They purchased the house next to the one they were already buying. Your father called it an investment property. But I knew better. They bought it specifically to sell it to me. I stopped reading, confused. They sold Evelyn the house next door? Intentionally? They knew I needed to maintain proximity to establish standing in the case. Living near them, being their neighbor, gave me credibility as someone with first-hand knowledge of their lifestyle and spending patterns. So they made it easy for me to buy the house next door, at a reasonable price, with seller financing, no credit check required. It was a trap. They'd invited her to move in next door, knowing it would make her look obsessed, knowing it would support their narrative that she was unstable and fixated on them. And she'd done it anyway because it was the only way to maintain legal standing. I moved in knowing exactly how it would look, knowing your parents would tell everyone I was stalking them, harassing them, unable to let go. I accepted that cost because the alternative was letting Dorothy die in neglect while her abusers walked free. Dorothy Brennan died in 1995. The financial exploitation case died with her. Without a living victim, there was no one to press charges. The civil case collapsed. But Evelyn stayed. I stayed because leaving would have proven their narrative, that I was irrational, that I'd moved next door out of obsession rather than legal necessity. I stayed because I'd invested everything I had into that house. I stayed because running would have looked like guilt. And then I was born. You arrived in the spring of 1998. I watched your parents bring you home from the hospital. I watched you grow from an infant to a toddler to a child. And I made a decision that haunted me for years. I would not force this truth onto you while you were too young to understand it. She explained that she'd had opportunities. She could have approached me as a child, could have tried to tell me what my parents had done. But she chose not to. You were innocent. You deserved a childhood free from the knowledge that your parents were capable of cruelty. I decided to wait until you were old enough to process the truth without it destroying you. She waited until I turned 18. And then she tried. I wrote you letters on every birthday after you became a legal adult. I called the house when I knew you'd be visiting from college. I even hired an attorney to formally request contact with you for the purpose of providing information relevant to a legal matter. Every attempt was blocked. Your parents intercepted the letters. They blocked my number. They threatened legal action if I continued trying to contact you. Their attorneys sent me a cease and desist, claiming I was harassing their daughter. I thought about the sealed envelopes I'd found in the kitchen drawer, the ones my mother had hidden after I discovered them. I realized they would never let me reach you while they were alive. So, I made different arrangements. I updated my will to name you as beneficiary, not of money, though there is a small amount, but of truth. I documented everything. I saved every piece of evidence. I recorded conversations. I kept a journal logging every interaction, every legal maneuver, every attempt your parents made to silence me. The letter's tone shifted, becoming softer, more personal. I want you to know that watching you grow up wasn't an act of obsession. It was an act of faith. I believed that you would grow into someone capable of handling the truth with integrity. I believed that you were not your parents. My vision blurred with tears. I never hated you, Nora. I never blamed you. You were a child raised in a house built on secrets, and none of that was your fault. You deserved better than to be protected from the truth as if truth itself were dangerous. The letter ended with the line that had broken me the first time I read it. You are the only person I trust to carry this forward. Not for revenge, just for truth. I set the letter down and stared at the rest of the contents in the box.
Documents.
Recordings. Years of evidence, carefully preserved, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. Evelyn hadn't asked me to destroy my parents. She hadn't demanded justice or retribution. She'd simply handed me the truth and trusted me to honor it. That trust felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. I spent the next 3 days going through the box's contents. I took time off work, ignored calls from my parents, and turned my kitchen table into a makeshift investigation room. The first thing I pulled out was a timeline, handwritten, meticulously detailed, spanning 35 years. Evelyn had documented everything, starting from the day she first noticed the financial discrepancies in Dorothy Brennan's account. August 12, 1993, noticed irregular transfers in DB file. August 15, 1993, flagged discrepancies to supervisor. August 18, 1993, meeting scheduled with director for August 24th. August 21st, 1993, Sarah and Michael Whitlock filed formal complaint against me. Every entry had a date, a description, and supporting documentation referenced by number. She treated her own life like a case file, building evidence the way she'd been trained to do as a social worker. I cross-referenced the timeline with the documents. There were copies of emails, memos, financial reports, and legal filings. Some were originals. Others were certified copies obtained through public records requests. Everything was organized chronologically, labeled, and annotated in Evelyn's neat handwriting. The pattern was undeniable. My parents had acted first every single time. Before Evelyn could file a formal complaint about the financial discrepancies, they'd accused her of being unstable. Before she could present evidence to the county director, they'd requested a psychiatric evaluation of her. Before she could testify in Dorothy Brennan's case, they'd filed a restraining order claiming she was harassing them. I found copies of the restraining order application. My father had written that Evelyn had repeatedly driven past their home, made threatening phone calls, and followed them to public places. Every claim was dated and described in convincing detail. Then I found Evelyn's response, a document filed by David Brennan on her behalf. It included time-stamped evidence proving she'd been at work during the alleged incidents, credit card receipts showing she'd been in different cities during claimed encounters, and phone records demonstrating she'd never called my parents' number. The restraining order was denied. But the accusation remained on record, feeding the narrative that Evelyn was obsessive and dangerous. I pulled out another folder labeled Court Filings 1994 to 1998. Inside were summaries of multiple lawsuits my parents had filed against Evelyn. None of them had been successful. Most were dismissed for lack of evidence. But that hadn't been the point. David had included a legal memo analyzing the strategy. The goal is not to win. The goal is to drain financial and emotional resources, establish a pattern of frivolous litigation by the defendant, and create a public record of conflict that supports the harassment narrative. Each lawsuit had cost Evelyn thousands of dollars in legal fees. Each one had required her to take time off work, appear in court, defend herself against baseless accusations. The cumulative effect was devastating, not legally, but personally. I found a section of the timeline labeled Financial Impact. 1994, legal fees, $8,400, 1995. Legal fees, $12,100, 1996. Legal fees, $6,800, 1997. Legal fees, $9,200. The amounts continued year after year. By 2010, Evelyn had spent over $150,000 defending herself against lawsuits designed to bankrupt her. Then I found the documents explaining how she'd paid for it. Evelyn had sold her car and started taking the bus. She'd sold jewelry, furniture, family heirlooms. She'd taken out a second mortgage on her house. She'd worked 2 jobs during periods when legal costs peaked, all to defend herself against accusations she'd never earned. I found a folder labeled Community Impact and opened it with shaking hands. Inside were copies of letters my parents had sent to neighbors, school administrators, and even my childhood friends' parents. One letter, dated 2005, was addressed to the principal of my middle school. We are writing to inform you of a safety concern regarding a neighbor who has demonstrated troubling behavior toward our family. While we have taken legal steps to protect ourselves, we wanted to make you aware in case this individual attempts to make contact with our daughter on school grounds. The letter went on to describe Evelyn as unstable and prone to making false accusations. It requested that school staff be instructed not to release me to anyone other than my parents without explicit written permission. I felt like I was going to be sick. Another letter, sent to our neighbor Mrs. Chun in 2003. We want to give you a heads up about the woman in the gray house. She has made unfounded legal claims against us in the past and has shown signs of instability. We don't want to alarm you, but we thought you should know in case she approaches you with stories about our family. This was how they'd done it. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet, persistent character assassination. A letter here, a conversation there, each one planting seeds of doubt and fear. By the time I was old enough to question the narrative, everyone around me had already been trained to believe it. I moved on to the recordings. There were dozens of them, stored on small cassette tapes and later on digital files. Each one was labeled with a date and brief description. I selected one at random. November 3rd, 2007. Phone conversation with SW Re. Intercepted mail. I plugged in headphones and pressed play. My mother's voice came through, sharp and cold. I'm calling to inform you that any further attempts to contact my daughter will be considered harassment. Evelyn's voice responded, measured and calm. Sarah, she's 19 years old. She's an adult. I have a legal right to... You have no rights where my daughter is concerned. My mother interrupted. If you send one more letter, make one more call, I will file for a protection order. Do you understand me? I'm not trying to hurt her. I'm trying to give her information she deserves to have. She doesn't deserve to be manipulated by you. Stay away from her, Evelyn. I mean it. The call ended. I sat there, my hands clenched around the headphones, listening to the silence that followed. My mother's voice had been so certain, so righteous. She'd sounded like a parent protecting her child from a genuine threat. But she'd been protecting herself. I listened to more recordings. In each one, Evelyn remained calm, factual, professional. She never yelled, never made threats, never resorted to the kind of behavior my parents had spent decades claiming she exhibited. She just kept trying to tell the truth. I found one final document at the bottom of the box, a handwritten journal entry dated 3 days before Evelyn died. I don't have much time left. The doctors have been honest about that. But I'm not afraid. I've done what I could. I've preserved the evidence. I've trusted it to the right person. Nora is 26 now. Old enough to understand. Strong enough to decide. I've watched her become someone thoughtful, someone who questions, someone who doesn't accept easy answers. I hope she forgives me for the burden I'm leaving her. But more than that, I hope she understands the truth is not a weapon. It's a responsibility, and I trust her to carry it with the integrity I tried to model, even when no one was watching. I closed the journal and sat in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by 35 years of documentation. Evelyn had been right about everything. The evidence was undeniable, comprehensive, and devastating. My parents hadn't just lied. They'd orchestrated a decades-long campaign of systematic destruction against a woman whose only crime was telling the truth. And I'd benefited from it. I'd grown up in a house purchased with stolen money, attended schools paid for with funds that should have gone to Dorothy Brennan's care, lived a comfortable life built on someone else's suffering. I hadn't known, but I'd still benefited. And now I had to decide what to do about it. I didn't rush into the confrontation. I spent a week preparing, organizing my thoughts, deciding what I wanted from this conversation. I wasn't interested in yelling or melodrama. I wanted the truth, spoken aloud, in their own words, without the shield of distance or time. I invited them to dinner at my apartment. My mother was surprised. I rarely hosted them, but she agreed quickly, probably relieved that I was initiating contact after days of ignored calls. They arrived on Saturday evening. My father carried a bottle of wine. My mother brought flowers. They smiled and hugged me like nothing was wrong, like I hadn't spent the past week uncovering the architecture of their lies. I served the meal I'd prepared, simple pasta, salad, bread. We made small talk about work, about the weather, about neighbors back home. I let them settle into comfort, let them think this was just a normal family dinner. Then, over coffee, I said, I went to Evelyn Marsh's funeral. The shift in the room was instant. My mother's smile froze. My father set down his cup with deliberate care. We asked you not to do that, my mother said quietly. You asked, I agreed.
I chose differently.
My father's jaw tightened. Why would you waste your time on that woman? Because she left me something in her will.
Silence.
My mother's face went pale. What did she leave you? The truth. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, not everything, just enough. Copies of key documents, the timeline, excerpts from Evelyn's letter. I spread them on the table between us like evidence in a trial. I know what you did to Dorothy Brennan, I said. I know about the financial exploitation. I know about the complaint Evelyn filed. I know how you destroyed her to protect yourselves. My father stood abruptly. That woman lied. Sit down, I said, my voice harder than I'd ever used with them. I have recordings. I have financial records. I have 35 years of documentation. Don't insult me by pretending I don't know exactly what happened. He sat. My mother stared at the papers on the table, her hands trembling. You filed a complaint against Evelyn before she could expose you, I continued. You accused her of being unstable, of fabricating evidence, of having a vendetta. None of it was true. She was trying to ruin us, my mother said, her voice breaking. We did what we had to do. You stole money from an elderly woman in your care. That's what you did. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? I demanded. Explain it to me. Make me understand how taking funds meant for someone's medical care and using them to buy a house was anything other than theft. My father's face was red. We were going to pay it back. It was temporary. We were in a difficult position financially, and we fully intended to. You didn't, though. You never paid it back. Dorothy Brennan died in substandard care while you drove a new car. My mother started to cry. Real tears, shaking shoulders, the kind of crying I'd seen from her maybe twice in my entire life. We made a mistake, she said. A terrible mistake. But Evelyn wouldn't let it go. She wouldn't accept that we were trying to fix it. Because you weren't trying to fix it. You were trying to bury it. I pulled out one of the recordings and set my laptop on the table. This is a phone call from 2007. You threatened Evelyn with a protection order if she tried to contact me. She was trying to tell me the truth, and you stopped her. We were protecting you, my mother shouted. You were a child. You didn't need to be dragged into our mistakes. I was 19. I was an adult. You were our daughter, my father said. And we weren't going to let that woman poison you against us. So you poisoned me against her instead. The words hung in the air. My mother wiped her eyes. We did what we thought was best. For who? I asked. For me? Or for yourselves? No answer. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted. Do you have any idea what you did to her? She spent 35 years isolated, harassed, financially drained, all because she tried to do the right thing. She lost her career. She lost her reputation. She spent every dollar she had defending herself against lawsuits you filed just to destroy her. She could have left, my father said. She didn't have to stay next door. She stayed because you made it legally necessary. You bought that house and sold it to her specifically so you could claim she was stalking you. My mother looked genuinely shocked. We didn't. I have the purchase records. I have the timeline. You bought both properties at the same time, moved into one, and sold the other to Evelyn at a suspiciously low price. You set a trap, and she walked into it because it was the only way to maintain legal standing. My father said nothing. My mother stared at her hands. She protected me, I said quietly. She could have approached me as a child, could have told me everything, could have used me against you. But she didn't. She waited until I was an adult. And when you blocked her then, she waited until she was gone, until she couldn't be threatened or silenced anymore, and left the truth with someone who could finally hear it. My mother's voice was barely a whisper. What are you going to do? I looked at both of them, these people who raised me, who loved me in their own broken way, who had also lied to me for my entire life. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I need you to understand something. The relationship we had, it's over. I can't look at you the same way. I can't trust you the same way. Whatever we build from here, if we build anything, it starts from the truth. No more secrets. No more lies. No more pretending Evelyn was the villain in this story. My father stood. If you're going to side with that woman,
She's dead, Dad.
she can't benefit from me siding with her. This isn't about her anymore. It's about me deciding what kind of person I want to be. And I don't want to be someone who stays silent about the truth just because it's uncomfortable. My mother stood too, gathering her purse. We should go. I didn't stop them. At the door, my mother turned back. We love you, Nora. I know, I said. But love without honesty isn't enough. They left. I closed the door and stood in the quiet of my apartment, feeling the weight of everything that had just broken and everything that might never be repaired. But underneath the grief, I felt something else. Relief. 3 weeks passed without contact from my parents. No calls.
No texts.
No attempts to defend themselves or repair what had fractured. I didn't reach out either. I needed the space to think, to process, to decide what came next. I met with David Brennan again. He walked me through the legal options. The evidence was strong enough to reopen investigations into the original financial exploitation. There were statutes of limitations to consider, but the documented pattern of harassment and abusive process could potentially lead to consequences even now. What would happen if I filed? I asked. David was honest. It would be public.
Messy.
Your parents would face professional and social consequences, maybe legal ones depending on what prosecutors decide to pursue. It would also consume years of your life. And if I don't, then the truth stays in this office and with you. Your parents face no consequences, but you keep your peace. I sat with that choice for days. I thought about Evelyn, who'd spent 35 years fighting, who'd sacrificed everything for truth that might never see daylight. I thought about Dorothy Brennan, who died in neglect while the people meant to protect her stole from her. I thought about myself, the person I wanted to be, the values I wanted to live by. In the end, I made a decision that felt true to all of it. I didn't go public. I didn't seek media attention or post the story online. But I did file the documents with the appropriate authorities, the state licensing board, the county ethics office, the financial crimes division. I submitted everything quietly, professionally, with a cover letter explaining the evidence and requesting review. What they chose to do with it was out of my hands. I'd done my part. I'd honored Evelyn's trust by making sure the truth existed somewhere official, somewhere it couldn't be erased or dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter neighbor. I also reached out to David about Dorothy Brennan's family. He connected me with a cousin who'd been too young to understand what happened at the time, but who remembered Dorothy with love. I used part of the small financial bequest Evelyn left me, $8,000, carefully saved despite all the legal fees, to establish a fund in Dorothy's name. It wasn't much, but it would provide small grants to elderly individuals in state care who needed assistance navigating financial systems. It felt right. Taking money that came from Evelyn's sacrifice and using it to help people like the one my parents had harmed. One Saturday morning, I drove back to my childhood neighborhood. I parked on the street and walked to the house where I grew up. The fence was still there, weathered now, some of the boards warped from years of exposure. It looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing, almost sad. I walked along it slowly, running my hand along the rough wood. On the other side was Evelyn's house, empty now, a for sale sign staked in the front yard. I'd considered buying it. I had the means, barely, and it felt symbolically important. But David had talked me out of it. Don't trap yourself the way she was trapped, he'd said gently. Honor her by living freely, not by repeating her sacrifice. He was right. So I just stood there, looking at the house where a woman had lived in exile for 35 years, waiting for someone to finally hear her. I heard you, I whispered.
I'm listening.
Later that week, I read through Evelyn's journals one final time. I'd been avoiding them. They felt too intimate, too painful. But I needed to understand her fully before I could let go. The last entry was dated 3 days before she died. I've made my peace with how this ends. I won't live to see justice, and I've accepted that. But I will die knowing I preserved the truth for someone who deserves it. Nora has grown into exactly the person I hoped she would be, thoughtful, questioning, unwilling to accept easy answers. I see it in the way she holds herself, the way she moves through the world. She doesn't know I'm watching, but I am. And I'm proud of her. She will carry this forward, not out of obligation, but because it's right. And that's the inheritance I always wanted to give her. Not money or property, but the knowledge that truth matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I closed the journal and cried. Not out of grief, exactly, but out of something closer to gratitude. Evelyn had been right. The truth was heavy. It was complicated. It had damaged my relationship with my parents in ways that might never fully heal. But it was also a gift. Understanding what had really happened meant I could make informed choices about who to be, how to live, what to value. I wasn't operating on curated information anymore. I wasn't living in a story someone else had written for me. I was free. My parents eventually reached out. My mother sent a brief email asking if we could talk. I agreed, but I set clear boundaries. We could rebuild a relationship, but only if it started from honesty. No more defending the indefensible. No more asking me to forget what I knew. They agreed. Whether they truly understood, or whether they were just trying to keep me in their lives, I wasn't sure. But it was a start. I also started talking about what I'd learned, not publicly, but in therapy with close friends, in spaces where I could process the complicated grief of losing the version of my parents I'd thought I knew. I learned that you can love people and still hold them accountable. That forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. That protecting yourself from painful truths doesn't make you safe. It just makes you ignorant. Evelyn had known all of that. She'd lived it for 35 years. And now I knew it too. Months later, I received a call from the state licensing board. They'd completed their review of the documents I'd submitted. While the statute of limitations prevented criminal prosecution, they were pursuing administrative action against my parents for ethics violations. My father had already retired, so the impact was minimal. But my mother's professional license was suspended pending further investigation. I felt no triumph.
No satisfaction.
Just a quiet sense that something had finally shifted toward balance. The house next door sold to a young family with 2 kids. I met them once when I visited my parents for a tense, careful dinner. The mother mentioned they'd heard rumors about the previous owner being difficult, but she seemed skeptical. The neighbors have all these stories, she said. But honestly, the house is lovely, well-maintained, everything documented and organized. Whoever lived here before clearly cared about the place. I smiled. She did. When I got home that night, I pulled out the last item from Evelyn's box, a small framed photo I'd found buried at the bottom. It showed a younger Evelyn, maybe in her 40s, standing with an elderly woman in a garden. Both were smiling. I recognized the woman from the documents. Dorothy Brennan. On the back, in Evelyn's handwriting, Garden Party, June 1992. Before everything changed. I set the photo on my bookshelf, next to pictures of my own friends and chosen family. Evelyn Marsh had spent 35 years being called dangerous. And my parents had been right about one thing. She was dangerous. Not to people. Not to families. Not to children. But to lies? Absolutely. She was dangerous to comfortable narratives and convenient silences. She was dangerous to people who wanted to bury the truth and move on without consequences. She was dangerous to injustice. And in teaching me that, in trusting me with her story, she'd given me the most valuable inheritance I could have received, the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're fighting alone. Especially when you're fighting alone. I returned to my apartment that night and opened my laptop. I started writing, not for publication, but for myself. A record of what I'd learned, what I'd chosen, what I decided to carry forward. I wrote about Evelyn. About Dorothy. About the complicated grief of loving parents who'd done terrible things. About the weight of truth and the cost of silence. And I wrote about the choice she'd given me. Not to destroy, but to understand. Not to seek revenge, but to honor integrity. I wrote until my hands ached, until the early morning light started filtering through my windows. And when I finally stopped, I felt something I hadn't felt in months.
Peace.
Not because everything was resolved. Not because my parents had fully acknowledged what they'd done. Not because justice had been served in any complete or satisfying way. But because I'd kept my promise to a woman I'd never truly known but who had known me better than I'd realized.
Idealistanat.
I'd believed her. I'd honored the truth she'd protected for 35 years. And in doing so, I'd become exactly the person she'd trusted me to be. The woman my parents warned me about had been dangerous after all, just not in the way they meant. If someone you trusted your whole life turned out to be protecting themselves instead of you, would you choose truth over comfort? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories about the secrets families keep and the courage it takes to face them.